family? I'm just doing a quick live real fast. I'm just gonna do this for a record. This is really interesting. What I just found out, well, I knew for a while, but I just I want to make it more of a point today, is that when you see group CT, it's interesting because CT makes some very dominant lineages, right? You get your DE, you get your CF, which CF makes everything, your F and everything underneath it, like your IJK and stuff like that, GHIJK, all come from CF. And DE makes your D and E lineages. But what's interesting about CT, it's not really talked about here. In fact, you'll see something that said like this: men who carry the CT clade have Y chromosomes with SNP mutation. You can see what's going on there. These mutations are present in all human male lineages, except, right? You see what it's saying here? Except A and BM60. That's very important. Now, what's important is that actually A groups are actually related to B groups, but what's interesting about B groups is that the B group is a little different than the A group because the B group actually comes from CT. I'm actually going to show that today, that B itself actually stems directly from CT. Now, I've been talking about it for a while. That if you look at an unrooted chart, you can see these things stem different. Now, it's no doubt that A and B stems together, but what's interesting about that is that I've been saying this for a while, that CT is Noah. CT is the root of Noah. And I'm going to show something to demonstrate that today. I'm going to show something off a PDF here to demonstrate that today. So it's a very important message, I believe. And it has to just do with understanding origins, right? When I say origins, it's like, the biblical narrative. And that's what we're going to talk about too. All people started out in Mount Ararat, right? They started out above, right? They started by, obviously, by Babel, where you see the land of, Shinar, where you get the land that Nimrod has settled the people at. But we'll talk about that. But first, let me show something here. I'm going to just go to something on here. Because I think it's fairly interesting. Not there. Let me put it on this. Let's try that again. Though I could probably just scroll to it and find it. Shouldn't be too uh, difficult to find. I just want to show the split here on here before I go to the actual image. Let me see if I can go to it real fast. I just want to go to the one that I'm looking for, just to talk about this thing that happens with CT and what actually is his lineages, and what a geneticist would see when he actually notes the split. So it's really interesting. So first, I'm gonna read this. Okay, so it talks about a little bit of some things. Talks about some SNPs, right? SNP mutations show that non-Africans, they call certain groups non-Africans, are not descendants of Africans of haplogroup A and B. Instead, they have a common ancestor of about 160,000 years ago, right? So it just talks about some things, talk about some papers and whatnot, looking at some things, looking at the exact split of it, right? That's what makes this paper really interesting, because it's really looking at the exact way that these split and everything. So they just talk about some things. It's going to start over here on this side. It's breaking down these A's and whatnot. And then when we start talking about CT and everything, long story short, what it basically says, none of the non-African haplogroups, that means CT and all those among CT, descends from this is, well, I'm going to say it again, descends from that departed haplogroup A1, A0 and A1B, right? In the graph above. That's very important, because a lot of times people think A groups make all the CT and those groups, but the way it actually splits has to be understood in detail. But let me go down to something. So it talks a lot about the A groups and how none of them make basically BT or CT, a couple things like that. And it just talks about how, they talk about how Arabian ones are different, and European ones are different. Haplogroups have considered above consistent of Arabic and European DNA lineages and whatnot. They just talk about how basically CT and BT are different. But let me work my way down to this part right here at the bottom part. I'm going to read this part right here. Figure 2, I'm going to go to figure 2. It says, shows that the non-African haplogroup CT, it's going to show that in figure 2, does not descend from African branches of haplogroup A. That's very important. Nor from haplogroup B, right? That's very important. So B actually doesn't make CT. That's very important. We're going to note that with its subclads. CT leaves aside all the African haplogroups, right? It's very important. That's very, very important. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to actually note something really interesting about CT. Let me actually go a little lower to that one because this is kind of like the start of it all. But let me go down right to it and talk about that. And we'll go to figure 2 and look at these figures and everything. Because long story short, it's basically expressing how, none of BT nor CT lineages descend from any of these groups, the A groups. It's basically letting you know that BT, CT is the start. It talks about BT and CT will be considered a start. I'm just going to keep going and show you something necessarily with B itself. So it continues to talk. CT does not come from haplogroup B, as it is obvious from figure 2. We're going to look at figure 2. B, they just let you know some things that BT-CT are actually more closely related under BT, right? Now, that's very important because I'm going to talk about a interesting controversy that it seems had happened. Because if you look on this chart right here, this little figure right here, we're going to look at another one. What's interesting is there's going to be a major root right here, CT. And CT actually, if you see right here, is a stem here. And CT actually makes B. B actually comes from CT. But there's a controversy that seems to had happened with these older roots, right? You get your A00 lineages, that these A lineages are going to be different than these lineages. They're going to be stems different apart. Going to be stems different apart. And it makes a major difference. It makes a major difference because a lot of times they'll say A00 was in Africa. Well, what's interesting about A00, a lot of people, they're Google warriors, but they never really look at the resources themselves or look at the Y chromosomes or stuff themselves. There's a lot of information for these things, but what I also found out is that this little source right here also had A00 on it. And this is the one I was looking for because this is the one that had A00 in ancient times up north. Now, if you look up what it says about A00, even on this PDF, which I'm still gonna show you a little more on B. If you look up A00, just gonna look it up real fast and just go to something. All right, so it just talks a little bit about it and everything, and it says right here, it says the highest number of SNPs, right? And everything it talks about is very old. Technically, it would be one of the oldest ones. It says haplogroup A00 is the most ancient one, pretty much the oldest one and the longest one. Is let you know that this haplogroup, and then even here they only put here that it was discovered in these places, but these are modern people. These people, the Mobo and the Cameroon person, they're modern people. The ancient ones that we found, the ancient ones that we actually found, are actually in caves with groups of people that were like Neanderthals, but they call them, I don't know how you say it, Denisovans. They were with them long time ago, mixing with them up in Russia. And that's very important to know because that's going to give us very important evidence of these things. So you can see the time right there. How long ago is that? Very long time ago. And you can see right here, over here in Russia. And I already talked about this exact area. This exact area, there were people mixing, like Neanderthals and certain groups that were mixing. Um, And these, when I say Neanderthals, I looked up their genetics. The Neanderthals, there's some that C groups that they call Neanderthals, and there's officially Neanderthals. Like they don't even have the same Y chromosome as anyone alive today. They're just, I don't know what to say about that. Just Neanderthals. Somehow they were mixing with them. But this right here, you can see Middle Paleolithic, let you know 100. That's a long time ago, right? That's some of the oldest finds, and this is A00. The reason why that's important is because a lot of people think that people started down here. Yah didn't make no one start down here. The biblical narrative tells us that people started over here from the beginning. We even see in the book, it lets us know at the area of Euphrates, right, which is the river that's connected with Eden. The Euphrates would have Eden there, right, because it lets us know in the beginning that Euphrates was at Eden. And also, then they get out at Mount Ararat. Flavia Josephus, in his book, he actually writes that Mount Ararat is actually by basically next to Armenia, close to there, right? Right next to the Zagros Mountains, right? Around that area, right? It talks about these things when it's talking about these things. But what happens is more important, that Nimrod, the son of Ham, comes up there, right? He himself basically tricks the people and basically tell them to all, become one, and they all become one pretty much. And you know what happens? Yah comes down and divides the people, separates the people, and they all go their different ways. And it talks about, how the people went their different ways, some by sea, some ships and whatnot, right? It talks about how they all went their different ways. But how did he scatter the people? He didn't scatter them by race, he scattered them by linguistics, which is proven today. We can still see divisions with linguistics. He scattered the people by language. So once they had one language, he confounded it, and then they all had a mixed language, which is evidence in linguistics. So he sets a difference in genetics, and he also sets a difference in linguistics. So that's very important, and we see the evidence of that, the biblical evidence of that, and the true evidence of that, truly. Now, the reason why I was showing this, because I just want you to understand that A00, if we find that up in the north at its oldest time, then that means that the world's false science of their bending of data to fit out of Africa is falling apart very quickly. It's gonna fall apart because truth is not gonna support it. People didn't start in Africa; they started up in the area of Mesopotamia. But let me show you something. Still continuing on CT, I want to show you something considering with CT, because I think these type of things are very interesting. I think sometimes the controversial things are very interesting because it's it's one of those things that you only can deny it if you don't want to accept the truth. You know, it's just, there's no way to deny it. Let me just put a space because that'll shorten the list, I believe. All right, let me see. All right, let me go to this one that talks about um, B, because it's real interesting when you see these things like this, when you see it more pinpoint. And I was talking to a geneticist about a lot of this stuff, and, he basically concluded the same thing, that basically the world that we're in, there's a lot of cover ups and whatnot. I'm going to show. So I showed you how B didn't make CT, right? Because a lot of times, when people see B on a classic, these type of family tree, and I talk about this, there's different ways to make this. There's circular mode, and then this is a normal mode, which, this is a horrible chart of a normal mode. And I say that because there's still haplogroups missing here. I already confirmed that there's sub haplogroups missing here. This is going to be normal mode, but the unrooted mode is going to show you a clear picture. Family tree should show an unrooted chart. That's what they should show, an unrooted chart, so that people can get a clear picture of what's going on here. But CT actually makes B. That's very important. This CT actually makes this one. This actually doesn't come directly from BT. It actually, BT makes CT, and CT makes B, and all these lineages are made. And what's important is that any other lineage doesn't make any of these lineages, but they stem out from BT. So BT just makes all these lineages. That's very important. That's very, very important. So BT is going to make all these lineages, and CT is going to make this lineage and all these lineages. That's very important. So basically, B would be monophylactic with CT. That's very important. That's very important. So B will be considered the same as CF and DE lineages. That's very important. That's just what it's letting us know. It's letting us know that basically, and I'm gonna go to it on this thing. It let us know that basically, if you want to really understand what's the real design of it all, you gotta really see what these geneticists see. What is it actually that they're seeing? They're not seeing the same thing that a lot of people who are just consumers are seeing, on the pages. They're seeing a little more detail. And that's what this paper was. This paper was all about the detail, about when examining the detail, it doesn't fit what they're trying to sell in media. What they're trying to sell in media was not fitting what actually the geneticists were seeing before them in their desks. All right. I'm gonna see where's this spot here. I probably went by it. But I want to show you, I guess, one more thing. I guess right here. Here's another summary. And I'm gonna go to figure 2. It just talks about a little bit right here where it talks about the CT, a little bit about CT. It just lets us know, different lineages are related, all the way from C to R, because they're connected by CT pretty much. Let me just go to figure 2 here, right here. Now, this little picture right here is so important. The reason why it's so important because a lot of times on the chart, a lot of times you'll get SNPs, right? A SNP is just, a sign of that mutation and everything. But notice on every chart, on how a chart works, you always want to note the ends, right? You always want to note where it ends. The reason why is because that's how you can note what's monophylactic and everything, right? This is always on every chart. You're going to always have a root. This will be considered your root. So this be a starting point. Now, what's interesting about this is that if you was to draw this, I'm just gonna do it on paint because there's different ways to draw. Like I say, right? There's different ways to draw a tree, right? It's told that in many different examples. But I'm gonna show you basically what this will look like if you was to draw it out. So you have your root, but what I'm gonna do is actually make the tree like this, because you can actually draw the tree like this in a straight line. You can actually do it like that. Now, from the root, what's interesting is you'll have another stem, right? And what's interesting is from that stem, you'll have a stem, right? You'll have a split, and you'll have a couple different splits, is what we're gonna note. So this one also has a stem, right? This one also has a stem, and it has other stems from it. It has other stems from it. So they have another stem, and then that one will have a stem, right? They have a stem from it. And then this one, because you'll see this will be your root right here, right? Always consider your root. I'll just make a circle there. This right here is considered the root. So that's going to be our root, right? Just make it yellow like that. So the root. And then you can see it's stemmed 2 different ways. And then from there, you have a stem, a different branch, right? Technically, a longer branch. I just want to show that the reason why is because once it's all said and done, I'm going to show you what I mean. So this has a different branch. And I'm going to just get rid of this one. I probably could just erase it, but there's another way to get rid of it. Yeah, I'll leave it like that. And what's interesting about it, what's interesting about this is that you're gonna know by the. In fact, I don't need to really do much. I'll just simplify it, super simplify it, pretty much. You can see basically what you'll have if you notice here. You'll have 1, 2, 3, and then you'll have this branch here. I'm just gonna do that on this just to make it simplified, just for the expression of it. So you have 1, 2, and you'll have another one, right? I'm gonna leave that right there. 3, right? Because that's how, like, you can have a tree. You can have if you make a tree, if you have a root, right? If you have a root, all you basically do, you just make a line. If you have a one line, like all these are just one line, all you have to do is make stems like that. Then you can make them what they are, like monophylactic and whatnot. And then everything of these will be monophylactic. All these be monophylactic. All these, because that's just a straight line. But what's interesting at the end here at the end of the last line right here, what's interesting is that's where you get CT, right? You get CT at the part of the end, and then you get your other lineages. Now, what's interesting about that just lets you know that they're family, right? But what's monophylactic is everything that's underneath the head of the corner, pretty much. But they're all related. These will be considered related, but they're not the same. That's what that means. What they're basically showing here, I'll just circle it. All these are one family. They are a little different though, because look, your B is different. You see how it's all coming, but they split. There's a split, so your A's are gonna split from here. You're gonna get some A's over here up to here. These A's are gonna be different than these A's. So these A's are different than these A's, but they're still A's, right? That's why you get some A2s and A1s and stuff, A3s and stuff. So just A1, A2, A3, right? But your B's are over here, but they're all gonna be, you know, considered monophylactic, one family, right there. But what's interesting about CT itself is a split, is a change, is a different line, is a different family, pretty much. To make it short, it's gonna be something different, something to note, something to note. The reason why is because the way that it splits, the way that when they show this, they're showing basically when they set it like this, what they're showing is how it actually splits, because then they go into detail and they make it right here, and then they show basically how it basically splits, what's actually going on there. And that the way they actually break it down, they let you know that this is BT and this is CT, right? It's not that an A is making this, it's that BT and CT is making everything else. That these are the roots. These are actually the root lineages. Now, what's interesting is it seems that it's definitely possible, because seeing this split like this, it's definitely possible to note that CT and BT are going to be the root of all people, right? Once that's understood, then you can start to see the picture a little more clear, that A and B lineages are different than your D and E and your CF lineages, right? It's just different, because you can note the stems, how they stem, and they'll be different. Like your CF will be different, your DE will be different, and your A and B lineages will be different. But the thing about your A and B lineages and your C lineage, because your C, technically they would let you know that C, because they're CT, these are all one family, but on a graph, they will put C connected with CF, because CF, they'll say CF and C, they're basically, one family, pretty much. And that's why you'll see it will say, C is related with F, as you see sometimes like that. And that's what basically this graph is. It's showing you how are they related. That's how we know A and B is related. They're very closely related, but not as close as D and E is related, because D and E is more closer related than B coming from CT and A coming from BT. Yet they will be more closer related. They will be still more closer related. And that's what this graph is showing. The graph shows that their B and A is related, very closely related, and they're all related. All of them are related, except there's these three splits. That's what CT is important for. CT is for the understanding of that split, the way it splits, is a very important thing. It's a very important thing to note. It's a very important thing, and the reason why it's important is because if you note, if you note that split, it's one of those things that as someone that's looking at these things, you note that genetics, it's not as clear as just going to Wikipedia and look at things up. Sometimes you got to talk to a geneticist and things like that. And sometimes you got to, get deep into what's going on there. Right. Like, for example, right here it says the authors of these ones, it says place the origin of haplogroup B to sub-Sahara, right? Region. And they just talk about it, just a sub-Saharan clade. We have shown above that haplotypes of B just lets us know they are actually remote from African haplogroup types, haplogroup A. It says, and obviously have a non-African, right? Just say they have a non-African origin, pretty much. They're letting you know that they have a non-African origin. That's very important. Then just lets us know CT and all those things. And that's very important because you get different groups that didn't start in Africa. They actually didn't start in Africa, but they started somewhere else. And even the note of how they split is important because it's a truth of the biblical narrative. I started to notice that a lot of these things make sense to the biblical narrative. Like the biblical narrative is true to what it's saying. He puts the life in the blood, right? And therefore, the life in the blood shows order. It shows a clear order that people didn't start in Africa. It's one of those things that is I always talk about, and it's very important. It's very important to know because the time that we're in, we're in such a very interesting time. We're in a very interesting time. So it's one of those things that I just wanted to express. So I just wanted to express that real fast that things may not seem as it seems, and things get very deep. It gets very deep. But from what it looks like, we're all closely related, and it's easy to see the divides of Ham, Shem, and Japheth. It's very easy to see the divides of Ham, Shem, and Japheth, and that's why I also recommend looking at an unrooted chart because the way that it divides is a long stem, but they're still going to be very closely related. They're still very closely related. In fact, that's why I say the split is actually at BT and CT. That's where the split is. The origin of people are not haplogroup A. The origin of people is at BT and CT. That's the origin of people. The BT and CT split for all your origin, 3 different generations. Your C and F lineages, your D and E lineages, and your A and B lineages. That's your Ham, Shem, and Japheth. So I just want to talk about that real fast. Nothing major. I know it's a late live, but with that family, just something to record for the record. Be blessed, be beloved, and amen.